Episode 57 January 23, 2025 Trump administration temporarily mutes federal health officials. In Episode 57 1A, United States Trump administration temporarily mutes federal health officials. 1B United States Trump retreat from clean energy puts the U.S. out of step with the world. Major economies are investing in ever-cheaper solar and wind power. 2A Ukraine Russia latest Moscow responds to Trump ultimatum. 2B Ukraine with support dwindling and Trump empowers Zelensky could face tough re-election. Main content. 1A United States Trump administration temporarily mutes federal health officials. Scientific meetings were canceled and research data on the bird flu outbreak was delayed amid confusion over the directive. Rozep view: if federal health officials are muted for long periods of time, public health measures such as vaccine mandates during pandemics, for example, any future bird flu pandemic, and a hope for regulation of air pollution allowed by federal mandate meant to control and eventually stop indoor residential wood burning for home heating in the future, will affect how localities might implement those mandates, one historically necessary and one hopefully enacted soon to protect human health in the future. However, this article describes how federal health officials are being muted only temporarily during the transition from Biden to Trump administration's. Rozep top excerpt from the article below. Dr. Ashish Jha, dean of the Brown University School of Public Health and the Biden administration former COVID czar, said the pause on communications was most likely a product of the Trump administration, particularly bumpy transition into the White House, rather than a coordinated effort to withhold information. Still, public health experts are wary of any changes to access of federal health data. Memories from Trump last term, during which political appointees repeatedly meddled in CDC reports and doctored guidance documents, are still raw. I think if it goes anywhere beyond February 1st, 2025, then we have a much more serious problem, Dr. Jha said. Excerpts edited by Rozep for brevity and clarity in relationship to residents against wood smoke emission particulates of 501c3 nonprofit organization. The New York Times, January 23, 2025. The Trump administration, moving quickly to clamp down on health and science agencies, has canceled a string of scientific meetings and instructed federal health officials to refrain from all public communications, including upcoming reports focused on the nation escalating bird flu crisis. Experts who serve on outside advisory panels on a range of topics from antibiotic resistance to deafness received emails on Wednesday telling them their meetings had been canceled. The cancellations followed a directive issued on Tuesday by the acting director of the Federal Department of Health and Human Services, who prohibited the release of any public communication until it had been reviewed by a presidential appointee or designee. According to federal officials and an internal memo reviewed by the New York Times, the directive enjoins the release of regulations, guidance documents, and other public documents and communications, including any notice, grant announcement, news releases, speaking engagements, or official correspondence with public officials until they have received approval. The new stricture applies to messages, to email groups, and to social media posts, and included a ban on announcements to the Federal Register, without which many official processes cannot continue. Some notices sent by the Biden administration in its final week were quickly withdrawn. The cancellations and communications crackdown sent a chill through employees of the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention and the broader scientific community. The moratorium is to continue through February 1st, 2025. The fallout was immediate. Officials at the CDC had been prepared to publish an issue of the influential Morbidity and Mortality Weekly Report on Thursday that included several items related to the widening bird flu outbreak on dairy and poultry farms. This week publication is now held up as a result of the order. Upcoming meetings of outside advisory panels on health issues have been canceled. Meetings to review grant proposals submitted to the National Institutes of Health were scrubbed. Members of the Presidential Advisory Council for Combating Antibiotic-Resistant Bacteria were told that their two-day meeting scheduled for next Tuesday and Wednesday had been canceled as the new administration considers its plan for managing federal policy and public communications. The directive was signed by the acting secretary of the Department of Health and Human Services. The confirmation hearing for Robert F. Kennedy Jr., whom Trump has nominated to lead the department, is not expected for at least another week. The administration has yet to name an acting director for the CDC or an acting commissioner at the Food and Drug Administration. Usually among the first moves by an incoming administration, the communications pause accompanies a spate of other changes facing federal employees since Trump inauguration on Monday, including a hiring freeze and end to remote work. While a pause on communications is not out of the ordinary, previous administrations have not restricted scientific publications like the MMWR or health guidelines because of their critical importance to public welfare. It is unusual to pause all communication from an agency where one of its critical responsibilities is keeping the public informed. Privately, several federal officials said they were confused about whether the restriction on communications with the Federal Register included health data. The CDC, for example, recently made doctors and patients aware of potential health risks about an emerging version of mpox and an outbreak of Marburg disease in Rwanda. The agency has offered new guidelines extending the recommendation for pneumococcal vaccines and has warned of an increase in the incidence of tularemia, a rare infectious disease in the United States. State and city health officials rely on CDC notices to make decisions for their communities, such as when to ramp up flu testing or which disease symptoms to keep an eye out for. It is hoped that the administration has a plan for disseminating more pressing public health information, especially in relation to the bird flu outbreak. In the past year, the bird flu virus called H5N1 has affected dozens of animal species and more than 35 million wild and commercial birds, resulting in soaring egg prices. It has also infected at least 67 people. The country recorded its first bird flu-related human death in December. Can something like the bird flu turn on a dime in 10 days? 1B United States Trump retreat from clean energy puts the U.S. out of step with the world. Major economies are investing in ever-cheaper solar and wind power. The United States risks further ceding a global market to China. Rozep view: the article below lists which countries of the world are investing in ever-cheaper solar and wind power, which of course is also clean energy in contrast to fossil fuel burning and wood fuel burning industrial plants, which are both unnecessarily dirty energy sources. When wind and solar clean energy is increasingly available and cheap in 2025 in Europe, solar now makes up 11% of energy generation. Britain closed its last coal-burning plant. In Norway, 90% of new cars sold were electric in 2024. Saudi Arabia has set a goal to generate half its electricity from renewable energy by 2030. China is home to nearly two-thirds of all the world utility-scale solar and wind projects under construction, and China companies are setting up electric vehicle Factories as far afield as Thailand and Brazil. China dominance of the manufacturing of inexpensive solar panels has driven down the price of solar energy globally. Rosep. This article goes on to list the countries like the Trump administration, United States, that seek to extract more coal, oil, and gas from the article. Of course, there are many countries pressing ahead to extract more coal, oil, and gas, even those that position themselves as climate leaders. Brazil is ramping up oil production, particularly offshore, even as it sets ambitious domestic goals to transition to renewables. Australia production of liquefied natural gas has grown over the past decade. Canada has steadily increased its gas production. There are also countries continuing to extract all the fossil fuels they can. Russia remains committed to exploring its oil and gas resources, although international trade sanctions have affected its ability to sell to the European Union since its invasion of Ukraine. Excerpts edited by Rosep for brevity and clarity in relationship to residents against wood smoke emission particulates, a 501c3 nonprofit organization. The New York Times, January 23, 2025. Trump repudiation of renewable energy technologies stands to make the United States an outlier in the world. Many of its large economy peers are choosing a different path, even as coal, oil, and gas still power the global economy and more fossil fuels are burned year after year. The movement globally is toward heavy investment in solar, wind, and batteries, the prices of which have fallen sharply in recent years. 2024 brought the world to a dangerous warming threshold. Now what? Worldwide investors poured nearly twice as much money into renewable energy in 2024 as they did into fossil fuels, according to the International Energy Agency. Trump energy-related executive orders seek to make it easier for companies to produce oil and gas and empower the government to stop clean energy projects that have already been approved. Coal use has sharply declined in the United States, mainly because of the availability of cheap fracked gas. Doubling down on fossil fuels puts the U.S. on a very different trajectory than Asian and European economies in particular. After all, relatively cheap oil and gas is what the United States has to sell to the world. It is the world's biggest supplier of natural gas, and it now produces more oil than any other country. The United States need not retreat aggressively from renewables, as the Trump administration vows. Doing so only cedes ground to its biggest rival, China. Purely on economic and security grounds, it is simply contrary to the U.S. national interest to restrict the continued growth of clean energy technologies. Global gas demand grew in 2024 and is expected to grow this year, though at a slower pace. According to the International Energy Agency, the global demand for oil is projected to slow, with demand peaking sometime within the next decade. Most of the rising demand is in Asia, including India, where U.S. oil and gas could find new customers. One additional headline on January 23, 2024: House Republicans float Medicaid cuts and more to finance Trump huge agenda. Rosep view: this Trump agenda includes cuts to clean energy projects. So where is the additional Trump administration spending plan? Additional spending to compensate for tax cuts for rich people, apparently. 2. Ukraine, Russia. Latest: Moscow responds to Trump ultimatum as 1,000 North Koreans killed in Kursk. Rosep view: NATO spokesman says support of Ukraine must continue. Trump calling the Russian war of aggression against Ukraine merely ridiculous is astonishingly insensitive, since thousands of people have died in a war that Russia started. Trump aims to be above the fray, and one who has no compassion for human suffering can always stay above the fray unless Trump engages in reality with the problems that Putin started, and which Putin must end, not because a war is ridiculous, but because a Russian war of aggression against Ukraine is wrong. Rosep top excerpt, which shows the economic weapons that Trump has said he may employ against Russia in order to end the Russian war of aggression against Ukraine, will instead lead to higher costs worldwide if Ukraine loses to Russia, according to a spokesperson at the World Economic Forum on Truth Social. Trump threatened to intensify sanctions and tariffs against Russia unless Mr. Putin agrees to end this ridiculous war. In its initial response, the Kremlin insisted it saw nothing particularly new in Mr. Trump's threats. Ukraine's Foreign Minister Andriy Sybiha praised Mr. Trump's remarks as sending a strong signal to Moscow, while President Volodymyr Zelensky, sanctions commissioner, told The Independent that there are at least 10 areas he believes Mr. Trump can look to target with sanctions. However, speaking at the World Economic Forum in Davos, Switzerland, Mr. Rutte said if Ukraine loses, then to restore the deterrence of the rest of NATO again, it will be a much higher price than what we are contemplating at this moment in terms of ramping up our spending and ramping up our industrial production. It will not be billions extra, it will be trillions extra. He added. Excerpts edited by Rosep for brevity and clarity in relationship to residents against wood smoke emission particulates, a 501c3 nonprofit organization. The Independent. United States, U.S. January 23, 2025. Russia has given its first response to Donald Trump's ultimatum, calling on Vladimir Putin to engage in peace talks or see his Ukraine invasion end the hard way. It came as Western officials claimed that some 4,000 of the estimated 11,000 North Korean troops sent to fight alongside Russia had been killed or wounded in just 3 months of fighting. NATO chief says stopping Putin will cost trillions if they don't support Ukraine. Now, a Russian victory over Ukraine would greatly undermine the power of NATO, and its credibility would cost trillions to restore the alliance's Secretary General has warned. Mark Rutte insisted that Ukraine's Western backers must not scale back the support they are providing to the country almost 3 years after Vladimir Putin's invasion began. 2. Ukraine with support dwindling and Trump in power. Zelensky could face tough re-election. The high popularity that the Ukrainian president had in the early days of the Russian invasion, with an approval rating of about 90%, has dipped. A new trouble spot for President Volodymyr Zelensky of Ukraine has emerged. The Rosep interjection: possibly Trump-supported revival of a political opposition animated by the prospects of a ceasefire and the elections that could soon follow. Rosep view: if Ukraine loses to Russia, the economic repercussions will be negative, since the world will be in chaos and divided between allies of Russia and NATO countries, which will have to expend additional capital to defend themselves against an emboldened Russia. Ukraine loss to Russia will affect whether the average American will continue to be offered a social safety net, including Social Security, and whether the average American will continue to be offered incentives for clean energy, such as rebates for heat pumps, which can serve as an alternative to polluting indoor residential wood burning. Rosep condenses the points of the article below. The Trump team appears to be working behind the scenes, meeting with Zelensky opponent Poroshenko, who appears to agree with the Trump team on surrender to Putin to end the war of Russian aggression in Ukraine. The Trump team appears to be eager for a Russian war of aggression ceasefire when a new election for president of Ukraine could happen, and when Poroshenko could possibly be re-elected president of Ukraine after a gap of many years. With the support of the Trump team, supporters of Zelensky argue that talk of election during a ceasefire increases the likelihood of Ukraine losing the war of Russian aggression by not being supportive of the acting Ukraine leader. President Zelensky during wartime, an opposition leader named Gorchenko, has said having an opposition during wartime will aid the Ukraine war effort for some reason, which to Rozep seems doublespeak. Zelensky, a military commander fired by Zelensky who is now Ukraine ambassador to the UK. One survey polling showed Zelensky in a hypothetical first round of a two-stage election poll promoted in this article as winning 24% of the hypothetical poll vote, with Zelensky at 16%. Rozep top. Excerpt in this article of facts showing that Zelensky has led Ukraine well during wartime since Russia invaded his country 3 years ago. President Volodymyr Zelensky of Ukraine has survived a military assault on his capital, assassination plots, corruption scandals in his government, political infighting, and ominous setbacks in his army's fight against Russia. He had enough support from Ukrainians to carry him through each time. No vote in Ukraine is possible while the war rages in the country is under martial law. Russia could disrupt any voting with missile volleys under the constitution. Elections must be called after martial law is lifted. Parliament first imposed martial law in February 2022 after the full-scale Russian invasion and extends it with periodic votes. Rozep top. Excerpt about Zelensky outreach to Trump. Zelensky did not attend the Trump inauguration ceremony. Zelensky had said he would travel to Washington only if invited by Trump. The Ukrainian president met with Trump in New York in September. Excerpts edited by Rozep for brevity and clarity in relationship to Residents Against Wood Smoke Emission Particulates, a 501c3 non-profit organization. January 23, 2025. The soaring popularity Zelensky experienced early in the war was shown with an approval rating of about 90%. The latest polling shows Zelensky support sinking above 50% in surveys that gauge his popularity against potential competitors if elections were held during a ceasefire with Russia.